This is a presentation of OneLogin training.
Welcome to Configuring the Office 365 V2 App Connector, Part 3. Now we can go into provisioning. Our first goal is to enable provisioning. With provisioning enabled, a user can be automatically created in the target application, such as Office 365, whenever the user is added to the app connector, either manually or automatically through a role the user is assigned to. For this course, we're going to focus on the provisioning process between OneLogin and Office 365, which really means we're provisioning into Azure AD, because as we already discussed, Azure AD is in fact the directory for Office 365. But before we go into how to set up provisioning between OneLogin and Office 365, let's take a step back and talk about some of the steps we would have done before we got here. In particular, what happens when you're using ADDS. We did mention, once upon a time, how we handle syncing with ADDS. We use the OneLogin Active Directory connector. So why aren't we talking about how to set up the Active Directory connector? Because a OneLogin implementation has 3 major steps that we recommend are done in a particular order. The first step is to configure how your users will be created in OneLogin. If you have ADDS, you should have already configured the Active Directory connector, and your users and their attributes would already be being synced with OneLogin. In fact, if you wanted to sync users from Azure AD, as we also discussed, you would have already done so in the first part of your implementation. No matter where your users come from, as long as they are in the OneLogin directory, the steps to set up user provisioning and single sign-on to Office 365 will be exactly the same. Therefore, this course is focusing on what you would be doing during step 3, adding in your app connectors. Okay, so back to our configuration steps. OneLogin provisions users into Office 365 by connecting to a couple of API endpoints within Office 365. In order to connect to the API endpoints over on the Microsoft side of the equation, you will need to enable OAuth. OAuth is an authentication protocol that enables 2 systems to trust each other. In order to enable OAuth, you need to first make sure you are logged in to Azure AD as an Office 365 Global Administrator with onmicrosoft.com credentials. Remember, we mentioned needing a global admin account with onmicrosoft.com credentials before. Well, this is one of the reasons. Thus, when you click on each authenticate button, you will be prompted to give OneLogin the rights necessary to connect to the API endpoints in order to create, update, and delete users when necessary. Actually, enabling provision for Office 365 is the same as with most other connectors. You need to check the Enable Provisioning checkbox after, of course, you enabled API access on the Configuration tab. Then click Save. You have to click Save in between these 2 steps. So, enable provisioning, click Save. Then, click the Refresh hyperlink on the Provisioning tab to ensure that existing entitlement parameters, like Office 365 groups, are pulled into OneLogin and can then be assigned as default values on the Parameters tab or assigned to particular subgroups of users based upon rules, which can be defined on the Rules tab. We'll talk more about these parameters later. But first, let's take a look at those provisioning configuration steps in real life. So, before we take the steps necessary to enable provisioning over on the OneLogin side, I want to check on a couple of things over on the Office 365 side. Remember that pre-checklist? Well, These are coming from the pre-checklist. So first thing, we want to make sure we're logged in with a global administrator account that is not using the domain that we're going to be federating with. So this global administrator has a username that's using the onmicrosoft.com domain that was automatically assigned when this Office 365 instance was created. So we have the correct account that we're going to utilize over here when we enable OAuth. And I'm already logged in as that user into Office 365. The other thing, we want to make sure that we have a domain that we've registered with Office 365. We do not want it to be our default domain here, but we want to make sure that it's registered, already set up, DNS records created, all that kind of fun stuff. And so this is the domain OneLogin train me that we're going to specify as our federated domain over on the OneLogin side. So now let's go over to the OneLogin side, and we're going to click on configuration tab over here. And we're going to first start off configuring our API connection. So we put in that domain that we were just looking at over in Office 365 and click verify. Magically, it checks to see, does that domain exist over in Office 365? It does. So now we have the ability to authenticate our OAuth connections to Office 365. We have to click on both authenticate buttons in order to get this done. So we'll click on authenticate here. It's going to pop up this little guy. I'm going to click on the Office 365 v2 link over there. And because I'm already logged into Office 365 with the appropriate account, it will automatically give me the OAuth authorization. Now I just need to do it for the second API endpoint. And voila, we've configured the API access. Woohoo! All right, next step for enabling provisioning is literally going to the enable provisioning checkbox on the provisioning tab here. So we're going to click on enable provisioning, and I need to save this change before we do the final step, which is refresh those entitlements. So now we're going to go back over to the provisioning tab here and click on this refresh link. So what it's doing is it's taking that API connection that we've just set up and basically querying for what are called entitlements. In the case of Office 365, really querying for Office 365 groups that we can then assign to our users when they are going to be created into Office 365. So it doesn't look very exciting when I click on that thing. What I want to do is go to my events and make sure that it was successful. And I can see that it was successful over here in my event viewer because I can see refresh entitlement started and it finished. So I know that my API connection works and we've done the initial steps that we need to go through to enable provisioning. So now we know the basic provisioning flow works. Before we continue on, I want to take a moment here to talk about some of the other options on this page that we did not change. The first option, require admin approval before this action is performed, controls whether or not a OneLogin administrator needs to come in and manually approve particular types of provisioning tasks. For example, with the Create User checkbox checked, every time a user is added to the Office 365 app connector, they will not automatically be created in Office 365. A OneLogin administrator will have to approve their creation by going to the user menu and going to the provisioning page. If you do not wish to have to approve every user creation, you can clear this checkbox. When initially setting up your app connector, we do recommend being as cautious as possible and requiring approval for all tasks: create, update, and delete. Once you are sure provisioning is working properly, then you can come and perhaps disable admin approval for one or more of them. The option below the admin approval section controls what happens when a user is deleted from OneLogin or removed from the app connector. By default, OneLogin will tell Office 365 to delete the user in Office 365. The other actions available in the drop-down are do nothing or suspend. We recommend you change this to suspend. The last option controls what will happen when a user is suspended in OneLogin. The default is to suspend them in Office 365 as well. The other option is to do nothing. So the only change we recommend you make to these options at this point is to change that delete to suspend until we have finished configuring and testing provisioning. Our next step in configuring provisioning will be to configure which parameters we are sending to Office 365 and what values or attributes we are matching to those parameters from within OneLogin. So we'll go to the Parameters tab, and then we can click on each parameter and map it to a user field in OneLogin or an available value we pulled from Office 365. Remember that refresh entitlement step that pulled in stuff from Office 365? Or we can just hard code in values we want to pass on through. So let's go take a look at what we can do on the Parameters tab. So to configure the parameters that are going to be sent to Office 365 as part of provisioning, we're going to go to the Parameters tab. And you can see several of these are required parameters. They're going to be sent over no matter what. Mutable ID over there, that's a value that's generated by like Azure AD Connect, if you've used that to sync your users before you move to OneLogin. And if you haven't used Azure AD Connect, it'll be automatically generated by our connector. UPN down here, a user principal name, is by default mapped to a user's email address. UPN and an email address look an awful lot alike, so it kind of makes sense, but users' UPNs might be different. They're coming from Active Directory, using that Active Directory connector. So if you want to match the UPN in Office 365 to the UPN that is assigned to them within Active Directory and you've got that connector set up, you can come in here and change the mapping from email to user principal name. User principal name there with the no spaces is one of the fields that would be populated within OneLogin. Now, the rest of these fields are kind of up to you. They're all optional. So you choose what values you want to send across. If I want to send department here over to Office 365, then I would select the department field, map it to the department user field in OneLogin, and make sure to check this checkbox here that says include in user provisioning. So if I have one-to-one matches like that for like a city field and a country field, I can, or even maybe like job title down here, I can go through and choose existing fields like title, there you go, and match them up, including user provisioning, and I'm good to go. Fields like display name, little extra step there. We have first name and last name as OneLogin user fields, but we don't actually have like a display name or a full name. However, we do have these things called macros. So if you go to our support site over here and look up attribute macros, you will see we have these guys. And so their full name is really like these curly braces with the word name in between. And I can plop that into the macro field and say include in user provisioning. So now their display name will be their first name space last name. Other parameters might need to match to existing values that are over in Office 365. We mentioned some of these before, like Office 365 groups. Remember that refresh entitlement step? Well, that's where this comes into play. So these groups that I see here, all employees, engineering, and sales, are existing Office 365 groups that I had created ahead of time. They got pulled over into OneLogin here when we did the refresh entitlement step. So if I want all the users that are assigned to Office 365 to maybe be assigned to this all employees Office 365 group, I'll select that group from the drop down, click add, and then again, remember to include in user provisioning and save. So now again, all users created from OneLogin into Office 365 will be part of that all employees Office 365 group. And last but not least, what we want to look at here on the parameters tab is going to be licenses. Remember, one of the major benefits of using OneLogin's Office 365 V2 connector is you can automatically assign licenses to those users. Remember, the Azure AD Connect doesn't do that. So when I go to licenses over here, similar to the groups, I will see what licenses exist over in my Office 365 instance. At this point, these are the only two that I have enabled, so we'll select one of them, click add, and again, remember to include in user provisioning and click save. So now by default, every single one of my users that is created over in Office 365 will have a license assigned to them, and that's what they will be able to access when they first log in. When we match values from OneLogin to parameters on the parameter tab, we were setting defaults for our users in Office 365. However, we don't always want all our users to be set to those same values. Therefore, we have the ability to create what we call rules. Rules are simple if-then statements, and they're created at the app connector level. A rule will look at user attributes and assign the user's values within the application. Here we can see that all users assigned to the Office 365 connector that are in the sales department, i.e. department equals sales, will be assigned to the sales group, one of those Office 365 groups, to the sales Office 365 group over in Office 365. So let's take a look at how to create our rules. So once we finished with those parameters where we set default values for all users that are going to be provisioned into Office 365, we can get a little more specific here by creating those rules we just mentioned. So I'm going to go to the Rules tab, click on Add Rule, and we'll call this Sales Group for the fun of it, and go and look at their department field, and if it equals sales, and we can spell sales correctly, then we can assign them to that Office 365 group called sales that we created ahead of time, and click Add. And we'll save this. So if we then also have engineers and we want them to go to a particular Office 365 group, we would simply create a new rule. Department equals engineering. And again, choose set group. Notice there's lots of things we can set with these rules, but set group to engineering, click add, and save. So we might have an Office 365 group for every department. We would create a rule to cover every department and assign them to the appropriate Office 365 group. At this point, you can create your Office 365 role and attach your new Office 365 V2 app connector to it. Make sure you've got a couple of accounts to test with. One that isn't in Office 365 yet, and another that may be created in Office 365 already, so you can test both creating and updating users through provisioning. Make sure both users are assigned to that Office 365 role. Because we're only testing at this point, it's probably easiest to manually assign the users to the role. So once you have the user set up, once you've assigned them to the role, then ask yourself a few of these questions. Were the users created and updated as expected? Were all the fields that you wanted to be sent over updated appropriately? And if you created any rules to update things like entitlements, were your test users able to match to those rules? So for example, we created a rule where we were looking at the department field and if department equals sales, assigning users to a sales Office 365 group. So make sure your test users, department equals like sales or engineering in this example. Again, always making sure that the attributes that you set are being copied over as expected. So finally, let's take a look at our own environment and test out. So let's take a look at how we might test with a single user. I'm going to go to my users over here and I'm going to see that I've got Mr. Sales User 1 over here, part of the sales department. And for testing purposes, in this case, we're just going to manually assign this user to our Office 365 connector right there and click continuing. Now it's going to double check, hey, are these all the attributes you want to send over? Notice underneath groups here, we have both all employees because we set that as a default parameter for everyone that's created in Office 365. And we have sales here because this user is part of the sales department. So that rule that we created that says if department equals sales, assign them to the sales Office 365 group kicked in. Also, see, again, the wonder of our connector is we have a license that's automatically being assigned to this guy. So I'm going to click Save. Now, remember that require admin approval option. We went over those options on the provisioning tab for the app connector. That's why this guy says pending over here, because by default, we are requiring admin approval before we actually go and connect to Office 365 and do anything. So I need to go over to users here, provisioning, and here I can see that create user event awaiting for my approval. So I'm going to click on approve. Now I can go over to the Office 365 Admin Center and I'm going to refresh. And what I should see is my beautiful sales user. And I can see, for example, like the display name is their first name and their last name. And if we go over to, in fact, my Office 365 groups and I look, for example, at the sales group and I look at members, I can see sales user 1 is part of my Office 365 group. So everything that I set as part of provisioning, what needs to be sent over, was sent over and I was successful. Woohoo! Now that all our provisioning testing worked out, we can assign our users to Office 365. And we're going to do that via role. Again, I can do it manually, but it's much more efficient to create a role and then automatically assign users to the role using a mapping. Mappings are like rules, those things we looked at earlier in provisioning. They're simply if-then statements, and they look at a user's attributes, and if the user matches the conditions set, then it makes a change to the user. The main difference between mappings and rules is that mappings affect user attributes within OneLogin. Rules are specific to applications and affect user attributes within the application. So let's go take a look at how to create the role and then automatically assign our users to the role via a mapping. So first things first, let's create our role. I'm going to go to users, roles, click new role, give it a brilliant name like Office 365 role, which see I've apparently typed once or twice, and associate it with the Office 365 connector that we have added. Then click Save. Now again, I can manually add users to this role, but what we want to do is automatically add our users to the role. So we're going to do that with a mapping. Users menu, mappings, click new mapping. Now for this one, we're going to call it Office 365. Oops, 365 mapping. That's the previous version. And click our check mark here. And we'll do this based upon their email address having a particular SMTP domain, because that's really what it's kind of trying to match up with over in Office 365 anyway. So we're going to say email contains and specify that OneLoginTrainMe.com SMTP domain that we've established over in Office 365. Then set role, and we see our Office 365 role here. So I can click save. Now we can in fact kind of test this out by typing in the name of one of our users. So let's try, for example, sales user 2 here. Click check, and voila! Sales user 2 will be mapped because their email address contains OneLoginTrainMe.com. So they will be automatically assigned. Now, again, we need to make sure that these mappings get applied to our users. They will fire off automatically when users are created or updated, but if we want the mappings to apply to our existing users, we need to do this little manual step called reapply all mappings. So it's going to create a little job in the background to run through all our mappings and all our users to find basically all the users that match the criteria that's been set and apply the appropriate changes. So if we go over to, for example, sales user 2 over here, we will now see on their application tab that they have been assigned to the Office 365 role. And because it was assigned through a mapping, it's got that sort of grayed out look to it in the double arrows. And we can see Office 365 here in their list of applications. Now, it's still showing as pending because we still have that admin approval feature enabled. So we still need to go over to provisioning and select our user and approve them. If we're ready to stop doing that and just have it happen automatically, we would go into our Office 365 app connector over here and want to go change that provisioning so that it'll create the users automatically, maybe update the users automatically, but still we want to be a little careful in suspending users. So maybe we'll keep the delete user requiring admin approval still. And remember, we also want to suspend users if they are deleted in OneLogin or their access to the app is removed. So we will click save. And now provisioning is enabled for all of our users that are going to be using Office 365. This concludes part 3 of configuring the Office 365 V2 app connector. Please continue on to part 4 so you can learn how to configure single sign-on and understand if you will need to make any configuration changes to support your client-side applications.
This is a presentation of OneLogin Training.